My name is Eleanor Grant, and I am 71 years old. I never imagined that the heaviest blow of my life would come not from illness or loss, but from the lips of my only son on the day of his wedding. The church smelled of lilies, the air thick with perfume and anticipation. I had spent hours choosing a simple blue dress, one I thought would blend dignity with quiet pride. My hands trembled as I clutched the invitation I never received, but always believed was implied. I had raised Daniel alone. Every birthday cake, every scraped knee, every late-night homework assignment, those were mine. There was no part of his life where I hadn't been present. So, of course, I believed there would be a seat for me in the pews when he said his vows. At the entrance, a young usher held a clipboard. He smiled politely until he read down the list. His expression shifted, his eyes darting back up at me. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he whispered. "Your name isn't here." For a moment, I thought it was a mistake. I straightened my back, tried to catch my breath, and whispered back, "Please, check again. I'm his mother." That was when I heard his voice. "Daniel. My Daniel." He stepped closer, his tuxedo crisp, his eyes colder than I had ever seen them. He didn't look like the boy who once clung to my skirts when he was afraid of thunderstorms. He looked like a stranger wearing my son's face. "Mom," he said flatly, "you weren't invited. You shouldn't be here." The usher stared at the ground. My cheeks burned. Around us, other guests shifted uncomfortably, pretending not to listen while leaning closer. I wanted to vanish, but I stood frozen, as if the ground itself refused to let me move. I searched his face for some hint of warmth, some spark of the child I had given my life to. There was nothing, only distance, only shame. In that moment, beneath the vaulted ceiling and the stained glass light, I realized something had shifted forever. My son had erased me, not just from his wedding list, but from the picture of his life. And that was the day I decided if he could erase me, I could erase the role of mother I had clung to for too long. I walked back to my car, my heels clicking against the church steps like a drumbeat of humiliation. The whispers followed me down the path, polite murmurs, pitying glances, the kind of looks that slice deeper than any blade. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands once I sat inside, my breath coming short and uneven, as if my lungs had turned against me. For the first few minutes, I could not drive. I just sat there, staring at the bouquet of roses I had bought that morning from the corner florist. Their petals were already wilting in the heat, drooping like my hope. I had imagined handing them to Sophie, his bride, with a smile that said, "I welcome you as my daughter." Instead, they lay on the passenger seat, rejected before they were ever offered. Memories pressed in. The way Daniel used to run to me after school, waving his test scores. The nights I stayed awake to finish double shifts just so he could have new shoes for basketball. Every sacrifice had seemed worth it, every ache in my back redeemed by his laughter, and yet, in one sharp sentence, all of it felt undone. I turned the key in the ignition, forcing myself to move, because sitting still felt like surrender. As the car rolled away, I whispered to myself, "Enough of being invisible." My voice cracked, but in that crack was something new, an edge of steel I hadn't heard before. By the time I reached my apartment, I wasn't just a grieving mother, I was a woman at a crossroads. The humiliation of that day did not only wound me, it woke me. If Daniel and Sophie had chosen to push me aside, I needed to ask myself why I had allowed them so much power in the first place. I laid the roses gently into the trash bin, brushing my palms as though I were dusting off years of unspoken pain. That night, I did not cry myself to sleep. Instead, I pulled out the lockbox from the back of my closet, the one filled with old deeds, mortgage papers, and trust fund statements. I stared at those documents, feeling my pulse steady. If my son thought I was powerless, he'd forgotten who I truly was. I spread the papers across my kitchen table as if I were laying out a map of my own history. The apartment was quiet enough to hear the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of the wall clock that had belonged to my mother. The lockbox had slept in that closet for years, but it woke up with me tonight. The deed to Daniel's house with my name in neat black type, the trust statements I had kept private, the letter from the bank acknowledging my guarantor status when he and Sophie insisted on a bigger place than they could afford. I ran my fingertips along the edges, the way I used to trace the curve of Daniel's cheek when he was little. Those documents weren't trophies. They were proof of every night I'd taken a second shift, every time I'd told myself I could live with less so he could have more. I remembered him at 8, feverish and small in his dinosaur pajamas, and me singing to him in the gray half-light before dawn, knowing I'd go directly from his bedside to the cash register and then to the accounting office. I remembered the year tuition leapt and I sold the last piece of my mother's land to cover the gap. I had never brought it up to Daniel. Love, the kind I believed in, didn't keep receipts. The phone lay face down on the table. I flipped it over and opened the contacts I rarely used, the banker who had helped me structure the trust without fanfare, the attorney who had drawn up the co-ownership papers when Daniel wanted the house, the neighbor who chaired the community board where Sophie once angled for introductions. My thumb hovered above each name. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for balance, restoring weight to the side of the scale I had let others empty. I brewed coffee, though it was far too late for it, then sat back down and read the fine print line by line. The terms were clear. My contribution was documented. My rights were not sentimental. They were legal. That realization settled over me like a heavy, tailored coat, warm, structured, impossible to mistake for weakness. When dawn pushed a pale ribbon of light through the blinds, I had a plan. I would start with the bank. I would confirm the notices they were empowered to send. I would inquire, calmly, about options if my portion of support ended. I would not raise my voice. I would not justify my choice. I would simply act. I rinsed the coffee cup, set it carefully in the rack, and glanced once more at the papers. My son had chosen to treat me like a stranger. I would respond as strangers do, with boundaries written in ink. The first time I suspected Sophie's shadow between us, it was over something small. Daniel had always called me on Sunday evenings. Nothing long, just a check-in. How was my garden doing? Had I tried that new diner in town? But once Sophie entered his life, those calls grew shorter. Then they shifted to text messages, then to nothing at all. When I asked gently if something was wrong, Daniel replied with words that sounded borrowed. "Mom, you worry too much. Sophie says I should set boundaries." Boundaries. I had given him the very roof over his head, and now I was being taught lessons in distance. I let it go at first, telling myself every young couple deserved their space, but the silence deepened, thickened, until I could feel Sophie's disapproval in every unanswered message. At Thanksgiving, the year before the wedding, she hosted at their house. I arrived with my pecan pie, the recipe Daniel loved since boyhood. Sophie met me at the door with a smile tight as ribbon on a box. "Oh, you didn't need to bring that," she said, taking the pie and setting it far from the other desserts. Later, I saw it untouched, hidden behind stacks of plates, as though my traditions were something to be cleared away. Daniel seemed oblivious, or maybe he chose to be. He hovered at Sophie's side, laughing at her jokes, barely glancing my way. When I caught his eye across the table and raised my glass in a quiet toast, he looked down instead. The final straw came months later when he told me, in a halting voice that Sophie thought it might be simpler if I didn't attend certain family events, her words, not his. "She feels you don't fit the image we're building," he admitted, and the shame in his eyes was not for me, but for himself, for letting the truth slip. I walked home that night with my coat collar pulled high against the wind. I replayed every moment I had welcomed Sophie, the birthday gifts, the offers to help with her boutique job, the afternoons I'd invited her to tea, and now I was off-brand, as if love could be marketed, curated, airbrushed. It was no longer about being included or excluded. It was about dignity. I realized then that Sophie's grip was strong, but Daniel's willingness to let her tighten it was the deeper betrayal. And somewhere beneath the sting, a steady flame began to rise in me, quiet but unyielding. It was the first breath of resolve, the knowledge that I would no longer shrink to fit their picture. The night after the wedding rejection, I did not sleep. I paced the apartment, the echo of Daniel's voice replaying like a broken record. "You weren't invited." It wasn't the words alone that cut me open. It was the coldness, the way he delivered them without hesitation, as if I were nothing more than an uninvited guest in his life. I sat at my table again, spreading out the papers like armor. Mortgage statements, trust accounts, the contract from years ago when I had co-signed the loan for their house. My hands moved, slowly, carefully, as though each document were a piece of evidence in a trial I was finally willing to attend. For decades, I had lived as though being a mother meant erasing myself. I wore plain clothes, drove an old car, let promotions pass me by so Daniel could thrive. He had no idea I had investments that grew quietly in the background, or that the quaking little apartment he thought I rented outright was only one piece of what I owned. I had chosen not to flaunt it because love doesn't need applause. But now, I saw the cost of my silence. He thought I was powerless. I whispered to the empty room, "No more." The words startled me, firm and unfamiliar. They tasted like steel on my tongue. By morning, I had called the bank. My tone was polite but steady as I asked what would happen if I withdrew support on the mortgage. The answer was swift. A 30-day notice would be issued. Next, I emailed an attorney friend. Not for advice, I already knew my rights, but for confirmation that I had every authority to pull back. He replied within the hour, affirming what I already felt in my bones. I did not tell Daniel. I did not warn Sophie. For years, I had cushioned every fall, softened every blow, made sure he never felt the full force of consequences. This time, I let the world deliver its own lessons. That evening, I stood at my window as the sun lowered itself over the city, turning the skyline a muted orange. I folded my arms and felt, for the first time in decades, not like a mother on call, but like a woman reclaiming her ground. I was done begging for a place in a life I had built. If my son had erased me, then I would erase the crutch he had leaned on for too long. 2 weeks after I made the calls, the first ripples began to show. Daniel phoned me late one evening, his voice sharp with irritation rather than worry. "Mom, the bank sent us a notice. Did you forget to make your part of the payment?" His tone carried the assumption that I was careless, that I had failed in some duty I'd never even promised. I held the phone close and spoke evenly. "No, Daniel. I didn't forget. I chose to stop." There was silence on the line, then a burst of disbelief. "You can't just... Mom, this is our home. It's also mine," I reminded him, my voice calm but firm. "And I'm no longer willing to carry your burdens when I'm treated as a stranger in return." He sputtered something about Sophie being right, about me never supporting their independence, then hung up. I placed the phone down without trembling. The notice had landed exactly where it needed to, in his hands, without my shield to soften it, a week later. Word reached me through an old colleague that Daniel's company had placed him on a performance review plan. For years, I had kept his position secure, not through favoritism, but through quiet advocacy. I had vouched for him, reminded the board of his potential whenever his numbers slipped. Now, with my silence, his record spoke for itself. Sophie's response was not silence. She took to social media with fury, posting photos of their house and long captions about toxic parents who refused to let go. She painted me as a bitter old woman, jealous of their happiness. Friends forwarded me the posts with raised eyebrows, asking if I'd seen. I answered every one of them with the same line. Yes, thank you. Nothing more. Inside, though, I felt the sting, not of her lies. I had been called worse by life itself, but of the realization that Daniel clicked like on those posts, as though co-signing the narrative. One Saturday, I passed their house on my way to the market. The lawn was overgrown, the paint beginning to peel on the porch railings. Sophie was outside, talking loudly on her phone, waving her hands in agitation. When she noticed me slowing my step, she shot me a glare so sharp it could have cut glass. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I simply kept walking, the grocery list in my purse, the sun warm on my shoulders. The house loomed behind me like a monument to choices they had made, choices that were finally circling back. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. It was early spring when I decided to step inside the boutique where Sophie worked. I hadn't planned it. I was walking downtown after a doctor's appointment. And there it was, the glass windows gleaming with mannequins in silk dresses. I almost kept walking, but something in me shifted. For months, Sophie had painted me as a bitter relic. Maybe it was time she saw me not as the caricature she invented, but as myself. The bell above the door chimed as I entered. Inside, the boutique smelled of perfume and pressed fabric. Sophie stood near the register, chatting with two women trying on shoes. Her voice was animated, confident, her laugh loud enough to carry. But when her eyes caught mine, her smile froze. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone sharp as glass. I let my gaze wander the racks, fingers brushing against soft fabric. "Just looking," I said evenly, though every nerve in her body seemed to bristle at my presence. The two women glanced curiously between us. Sophie raised her chin and stepped closer. "This isn't really your kind of store," she said under her breath, low enough for the customers not to hear. "These prices aren't for everyone." Her words were meant to sting, but I didn't flinch. I pulled a pale scarf from the rack, held it up against the light, and then walked calmly to the counter. From my wallet, I drew out the gold membership card the store itself had mailed me years earlier, back when I still indulged in small luxuries. I placed it on the counter without a word. The cashier's eyes widened. "Of course, Mrs. Grant. Would you like us to gift wrap this?" Sophie's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, caught between disbelief and anger. The two customers whispered to each other, watching the exchange with thinly veiled interest. I smiled gently, sliding the scarf back across the counter. "Not today. I just wanted to see if I still belonged here." The cashier nodded politely, but Sophie stood frozen, humiliated not by anything I shouted, but by the quiet proof that I was not the frail, needy woman she had described online. I turned toward the door, my steps unhurried, my back straight. As I pushed it open, I caught Sophie's reflection in the glass, her eyes following me, burning with the knowledge that her mask had slipped in front of witnesses. The bell chimed again as I stepped into the sunlight, the cool air filling my lungs like victory. The storm broke one Friday night when my phone buzzed with message after message. Friends, neighbors, even women from my church group sent me screenshots. Sophie had posted a long tirade on Facebook, accusing me of being manipulative, of ruining their marriage, of clinging to control like a jealous ex-wife. Her words were venomous, dressed up in hashtags and staged photos of her and Daniel looking strained but united. And right beneath it, Daniel had clicked the little blue thumbs up. For years, I had stayed silent, believing silence was dignity. But that night, I realized silence had only given her story the stage. I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and pressed the button that said, "Go live." My reflection filled the screen, an old woman with tired eyes, but eyes that still burned. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady. I don't usually speak on social media, but since my name is being dragged here, it seems only fair to respond in the same place. I reached for the folder beside me and held up a document. This is the deed to Daniel and Sophie's house. My name is right here, listed as co-owner, because I helped them purchase it when they couldn't afford to. This, I said, flipping to another page, is the trust I created for Daniel's education, money I earned from double shifts while raising him alone, and this, I pressed play on my phone, and a recording filled the quiet room. Sophie's voice, sharp and careless, rang out. "Your mother's just an ATM. Keep her happy until we don't need her anymore." I let the words hang in the air before continuing. I don't share these things to embarrass anyone. I share them because lies grow when truth hides. I have nothing to prove except that I loved my son and supported him beyond measure, but I will not be erased or disrespected any longer. Within minutes, the viewer count climbed into the hundreds, then the thousands. Comments poured in. "We believe you, Eleanor, Team Eleanor. What a strong woman." By the time I ended the stream, my heart was racing, not from fear, but from release. I had spoken the truth, calmly and clearly, and the world had listened. The next morning, Sophie deleted her post. Daniel called but hung up before leaving a message. And by Monday, word spread that his company had let him go. The boutique where Sophie worked announced she was no longer with us. The tide had turned, not with rage, but with truth exposed under the light. When the storm quieted, I discovered a silence that finally felt like peace. Daniel and Sophie's carefully built image crumbled. The bank took their house, their cars disappeared, and the online life they had flaunted so boldly went dark. Then a letter came in Daniel's handwriting. Inside were words raw with regret. He admitted he had let Sophie's ambition and his own pride blind him. He told me he had begun therapy, that he wanted to understand why he had turned so cruelly against the woman who had raised him. At the end, he begged for a chance to see me. I folded the letter and set it aside. My heart ached, but I did not call. Forgiveness is not an obligation. It is a choice. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let another person sit with the truth. A month later, I moved west to Portland. My new apartment overlooked a park where children played, their laughter carrying into my windows like music. I joined a women's center, teaching young mothers how to guard their finances and protect their dignity. On weekends, I volunteered at a food pantry, giving warmth where it was welcome. At night, I wrote, I called my manuscript Retiring from Motherhood, not because I stopped loving my son, but because I stepped away from a role that had erased me. My story was not about loss. It was about reclaiming myself. Sometimes I imagine a woman my age opening that book, recognizing her own pain in my words, and finding strength to draw her own boundaries. That thought steadies me. I was not erased. I built a life of my own choosing, and in that life, at last, I found freedom. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, Please subscribe and join me for more every day.